Are you getting this up here?
Indeed I am.
Nice. Alright.
Now I am.
We're studying the blood today. And we're going to go in the lab today and look at blood cells. That should be interesting. But you need to know what you're looking at and looking for. So the blood, if you were to put blood in a test tube and let it sit for a while, if you put some kind of agent in there that didn't allow the blood to clot, which means form like a scab, because it's got chemicals in it that'll do that when it's still.
It's gross.
You'll see that the red blood cells, which are heavier, go down to the bottom. And these are what the red blood cells look like. They look like little tiny discs. And they are originally made in the bone marrow. Your bone marrow makes blood cells. Those are the centers of your bones. Now, only certain bones have red bone marrow. And it's mostly bones kind of in the middle of your body. I think your sternum, your vertebrae, your pelvis, your scapulae. I think bones that are more toward the middle. Maybe your femur, parts of your femur. To check on that. It's one of those things I always kind of wasn't sure about. You ever have those things and you just never check on them because there's other stuff on TV. Are you with me, Leah? Anyway, all the blood cells are made in the bones, and then they leak out of the bones and they get into the bloodstream. And here, so the red blood cells, which are the heaviest by density, would go down to the bottom of the test tube, and here they are. And they're the smallest cells in the body, and they're the most numerous. 1 cubic millimeter of blood. Do y'all know how big a millimeter is, by the way? Are you familiar with the metric system? A millimeter is about the width of a dime. It's like that. The distance between my thumb and my finger there, just about like that. So a cubic millimeter of blood, cubic millimeter this way, and that way, coming out at you. A little tiny cube of blood. Less than a drop. Much less than a drop. Has on average about 7 million blood cells in it. 7 million, you're probably more familiar with that number. That's a lot. So these cells are small. Now, crawling around with these red blood cells, in this layer right here, as it would separate out, which is called the buffy coat, I'm not sure why they call it that, are white blood cells and platelets. The white blood cells are cells that kind of move around inside the blood system and inside your lymphatic system, and they fight infection. They kill things that aren't supposed to be there. All the time, through little cuts in the skin, and as you eat, and as you breathe, you're taking in bacteria and viruses, things that could cause your body a lot of harm. There's all sorts of microscopic creatures in the world trying to live. If they get in you, they can start eating you up. It's the job of these white blood cells to kill them. And the white blood cells do other things too. They clean up your body. When cells inside your body die, the white blood cells come along like little garbage trucks and take them apart piece by piece and destroy them and recycle them so that all the components of the dead cell can be reused by your body. It's a very important job because your cells don't live forever. And so as new cells multiply and old cells die, they have to be cleaned. And that's the job of the white blood cells. There are different types of white blood cells, and we're going to study the different types here in just a second. The platelets are pieces of cells And it's basically blood cells that have kind of fallen apart and are in pieces. And they fall apart during their formation. They haven't lived as a cell yet. They're kind of, during formation, some of the cells fall apart into pieces. And that's important. We need those pieces. They're called platelets. And they're there to help blood clot. And in 2 days, we're going to study the clotting mechanism of the blood. But it's important, if you cut yourself, that you don't bleed to death. And the platelets help make a scab which stops the bleeding. Platelets are important to stop bleeding. And so these are the things we'll be looking at here. Red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And then there's a liquid portion of the blood called plasma that is mostly water, but there's a lot of other substances kind of dissolved in it that makes your blood a liquid. If you're looking at blood, it looks liquidy, and that's because all this plasma here. Over half the blood is plasma. Anyone ever seen blood in a little bag from a blood bank? Yeah, you give blood, they put it in little bags, and it'll last for about 2 months. And they give it to patients in the hospital that lose a lot of blood. What's that?
If you get blood from someone and they have like different immunities than you, do you receive their immunities? Like,
yeah, well, what they do is they try to give you the same blood type, first of all, so that your body doesn't reject the cells themselves. We're going to talk about blood types in 2 days, too. But some of the stuff that's in their blood, the little tiny antibodies and stuff, you would get some of that. Of course, they're probably not going to give you a whole lot of that blood. Most people don't get entire transfusions, is what you're talking about, when you take all your blood out and replace it fully with somebody else's blood, or a combination of people's blood. So usually you don't get it. Usually just get a little packet of blood for however much you've lost. And you wouldn't get that much of their antibodies then. But it can happen where you get a lot more. And they've tried that to, somebody who's gotten over a disease, who has the antibodies, they can transfuse somebody who has the disease, and maybe that'll...
Does it work?
Sometimes, yeah. That's a choice. It's kind of something that's being studied right now, because they're not exactly sure how often that works, and if that's a good remedy for them. Some of the people, I was watching a video just recently, some of the people who had Ebola, y'all heard of that virus? It's a flesh-eating virus that kills you real fast. They tried that with, and it saved them. And they're like, well, maybe that works. This is what a red blood cell looks like. It's concave in the middle. You see how it dents downward like that? It's called concave. And the reason why it's like that is there's no nucleus. A red blood cell has lost its nucleus. During the formation of the red blood cell, the nucleus comes out. And you're just left with the rest of the cell. And with the nucleus out, there's more space in there for holding oxygen. Because that's the job of the red blood cell, to bind to oxygen. It's got a molecule in it called hemoglobin, which contains iron. And the hemoglobin will bind oxygen. One red blood cell can hold about 4 billion oxygen atoms. Or oxygen molecules, I should say. So molecules are a lot smaller than cells. And one cell can carry a lot of oxygen. And because the nucleus is gone, it can carry even more. Now, since the nucleus is gone, the cell cannot repair itself and cannot continue with its cellular processes, because the DNA in the nucleus directs the cellular processes. And so these cells tend to wear out pretty quickly. And if the cell wall gets damaged, then the cell will just kind of die. And then the cells have to be cleaned up by the white blood cells and removed. You have an organ called the spleen, that's kind of in charge of straining the blood and getting rid of dead, old blood cells that aren't working right. And so new blood cells have to constantly be made. Yeah?
2 questions. The first one is, what happens to the nucleus? Where does it go?
That's a good question. It's in the bone marrow when the nucleus comes out, and it must be at that point torn up and the DNA reused, the nucleotides. That's a good question. I don't really know for sure.
And can I go blow my nose?
Yes. Hey, there's a red blood cell under an electron microscope. They use false color. Electron microscopes don't give you colored pictures. They go in with computers and add the color later to what color they think it should be. But it's still pretty. There's a hormone called erythropoietin, which is given off by the liver and kidneys and causes more blood cells to be made in the bone marrow. And they talk about that some in the book. I'm not going to spend much time on it to give you a little more lab time today. But I do want you to see this chart right here. It's on page 321, and it shows how each type of blood cell is formed. And I want you today under the microscope to try and find each type of blood cell here. And here at the top of the chart is a hemocytoblast. That is the cell from which all blood cells come. And everything from here down to here takes place inside the bone marrow. All these transformations. This cell can become a myeloid stem cell, which can become a proerythroblast, which can become an erythroblast, which can become a normoblast, which can become a reticulocyte, which can eventually become an erythrocyte. You don't have to memorize all these steps. What you do have to memorize is this bottom, what they end up as. An erythrocyte is the scientific word for a red blood cell. An erythrocyte. And this is what is circulating in the blood. See, it says in circulating blood? And all of these steps happen in the bone marrow, so you won't see them in our slides today, because the slide I'm going to give you is a blood slide. It's just got blood in it. And blood is this down here. So you'll see mostly erythrocytes in the slides I give you. You'll see thrombocytes, which are also known as platelets, little tiny pieces of cells. And you'll see them, they're real small, but you'll see them. And there's 5 types of white blood cells. There's actually 6 types that you need to know. Neutrophils, which look like this. Basophils, which look like this. Eosinophils, which look like this. And we're going to talk about what each of these types do tomorrow. But if you'll notice, like for instance, eosinophils have little red granules in them. They're difficult to find. But if you'll find them, when you find them, you'll see. You'll have to move the slide around with your thumbs as you're looking at the blood cells today to find each type here. You won't just put the slide down and there they are. You have to slide them around. I mean, you'll be able to see erythrocytes. They're everywhere. And you'll see a few of these scattered around. But to find each one, you're going to have to look. Anyway, we call these 3 the granulocytes because they have little grains inside them. And those little grains are little vesicles that contain enzymes that help the cells do their job, that help the cells kill things. This big type right here is a monocyte. They're real big. And they will, whenever you have damage, like if you get hit in the head with something, wherever there's damage, these things will squeeze out of the blood vessels and crawl around and turn into what we call macrophages, which are just white blood cell consumers. They just start eating everything they see. And then these two cells are called lymphocytes, T cells and B cells. You can't tell the difference by looking at a T cell and a B cell. They both look the same. So we'll just call them a lymphocyte. If you see one that looks like this, you can always tell a lymphocyte because the cell is almost all nucleus. There's hardly anything else in the cell. The nucleus is real large. And if you studied biology, some of y'all took AP Bio, we talked about the T cells and B cells. Do y'all remember that? The B cells produce antibodies, and the T cells, they crawl around and kill infected cells in the body. And there's helper T cells and killer T cells and memory T cells and memory B cells. We learned about that in biology. Anyway, you can see the B cells can become plasma cells, which looks like this. You won't see either of those. So these are what you'll see. So what we want to do is I want you to read 12.1 and 12.2 tonight. And I want you to take your book in there. And we're going to be looking for these cells. Turn, if you would, to page 323. You'll want to have this book with you. This right here, that's a neutrophil. How can you tell a neutrophil? It has a lobed nucleus. A lobe is like that's a lobe, and that's a lobe, and that's a lobe, and that's a lobe. The nucleus comes in sections called lobes. And so you could tell a neutrophil if you see this lobed nucleus that looks like this with a bunch of dark stained granules. Now, when you're looking at it under your scope, you're not going to see it nearly this big. It's going to be a lot smaller. And you can come over to me and say, I think I got a neutrophil, Mr. Willis. Can you look at this? Neutrophils account for 54 to 62% of the white blood cells in a typical sample. These, again, are cells that crawl around killing things. Now, this is an eosinophil. Can you see how different that is from that?
Yeah.
You'll see if you see one, it's got a bunch of red particles in it. There aren't many of these. They're very rare. If you find one, you may have to show everyone else. Eosinophils make up 1 to 3% of the white blood cells. You might only have 1 or 2 of these on your whole slide. You have to move the slide around to find it. Page 324. This is a basophil. A basophil has darker granules in it than a neutrophil. So let's look back. There's a neutrophil. And there's a basophil. Can you see the difference? Dark purple granules. It looks like the nucleus is also lobed. It's a pretty big nucleus. But there's definitely a lighter background on the neutrophils here. The basophil has granules that stain deep blue. This type of white blood cell produces heparin, which prevents inappropriate blood clotting, and histamines, which increase circulation to injured tissues. Basophils take part in certain allergic reactions. How many have allergies? What happens, let's say you're allergic, I'm allergic to dust. If I get dust in my eyes, these things right here will squirt out a chemical called histamine. And histamine causes swelling. And so my eyes will swell up real bad if I'm around dust. And so you know what I do to get rid of that reaction? Take a drug. You know what it's called?
Antihistamine.
Do it, Michael. Good job. And the antihistamine works against the drug. So these things produce histamine. And they account for less than 1% of circulating white blood cells. So it'll be hard to find one of these too. This one and that one are the hardest to find. If you find those, yell out. Let everybody know and we'll come look at it. This right here is a monocyte. A monocyte is the largest of the blood cells. You see, look how big this is compared to a blood cell. And then look back at this compared to a blood cell. It's a little bit smaller. These other ones are smaller. See, that blood cell is close to that. And this one is a lot bigger than the blood cell. We call that a monocyte. These are the ones, again, that become what we call macrophages. They crawl out of the bloodstream and eat a bunch of different organisms that they find at an injury. And they make up 3 to 9% of the white blood cells. And finally, there's the last one. That's a leukocyte. Either a T cell or a B cell. The thing about these is they're small. They aren't much bigger than a red blood cell. They're about the same size. And they have the huge nucleus that takes up almost the whole cell. You'll all have some of these on your slide. They account for 25 to 33% of white blood cells. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first give you a drawing sheet here.